So imagine a judge sitting on the bench in a modern courtroom,
Okay.
and a man is brought before him, right?
Hmm.
He's charged with stealing a pretty significant amount of specialized, highly regulated medical equipment.
Right. High stakes.
Exactly. And the law is absolute here. The mandatory minimum sentence for grand larceny of medical supplies is, let's say, 10 years in a federal penitentiary.
Ouch. Yeah.
Yeah. And the prosecution lays out just a flawless case. The evidence is undeniable. The guy even confesses.
Well, open and shut case then, right?
You'd think so. But then, the context emerges. The man's community had been totally cut off by a catastrophic infrastructure failure.
Oh, like a localized grid collapse or something.
Yeah, or a severe natural disaster.
Yep.
And the corporate entity controlling these medical supplies had locked down their warehouses. They were citing, liability protocols.
Basically leaving the injured to die because of paperwork.
Exactly. So the man broke into the warehouse, stole the supplies, and distributed them to the triage centers. He literally saved dozens of lives.
Wow. Okay, I see where this is going.
Right. Now, the judge faces this terrifying paradox. I mean, if he follows the absolute letter of the law, he condemns a literal hero to a decade in a cage.
Which is a profound moral atrocity.
Exactly. But if he ignores the law, he shatters the illusion of legal consistency. He undermines the very system he swore a sacred oath to uphold. So what does he do?
I mean, that right there, that is the ultimate collision between the rigid architecture of the state and the messy, bleeding reality of human ethics.
Yeah.
That judge is standing precisely at the intersection of law and justice, which, as we're about to explore, are rarely the exact same thing.
And that is exactly where we are planting our flag today. So welcome to the Deep Dive.
Glad to be here.
And to the learner out there listening, whether you are prepping for a boardroom negotiation or trying to untangle a complex ethical dilemma in your own life, or just profoundly curious about the philosophical plumbing that keeps civilization from collapsing, you are in the right place.
Absolutely.
We have a really highly customized intensive session for you today. We are continuing our systematic excavation of Albert Pike's Morals and Dogma.
Yes, we are.
Specifically, we are cracking open the dense, intimidating, and endlessly fascinating Chapter 21, the Noachite, or Prussian Knight.
And, for anyone who has been following along with our previous sessions, this chapter is going to feel like a massive shock to the system.
Oh, it really is. I mean, in our previous deep dive covering Chapter 20, we were swimming in some incredibly deep, abstract, and honestly quite esoteric waters.
Very esoteric.
We were dissecting symbolism, the epistemology of how we perceive truth, the endless labyrinths of interpretation. It felt like a high-level graduate seminar in linguistics.
Like learning how to read the underlying code of the universe.
Yeah, exactly. But today, the source material pivots with the subtlety of a freight train. We are leaving the poetry class, and we are walking straight into the courtroom.
Right.
We are moving from the philosophy of how we interpret the world directly into the heavy, uncompromising mechanics of how we are responsible for it.
And that pivot is just essential to understanding the entire structure of the text. Because Pike essentially argues that all the philosophical contemplation in the world is totally useless if it doesn't eventually manifest in practical, moral action.
That makes a lot of sense.
Right. All that mastery of symbols and ancient mysteries doesn't mean anything if you don't act. And the archetype we are analyzing today, the Noachite or Prussian Knight, is the embodiment of that transition.
Stripping away the lofty mysticism.
Exactly. This chapter forces us to look at the raw mechanics of human interaction, like how we maintain social order, how we judge one another fairly, and, most intimidating of all, how we take total, unmitigated ownership of our choices.
Which brings us to the core mission, right? The driving question for this entire deep dive. And it's a question that sounds really simple on its face, but gets infinitely more complicated the closer you look at it.
And that question is,
what does it truly mean to be accountable for your actions? I mean, we teach our kids to apologize when they break a window. That's easy. But when you scale accountability up to the level of complex, layered adult societies, like governments, corporations, legal systems, accountability becomes this massive, tangled web.
it really does. Because in complex systems, the consequences of our actions are separated from the actions themselves by layers of bureaucracy and time and distance.
Yeah, there's so much buffer.
Right. So before we can even untangle that web, We really have to understand the ground we are standing on. To grasp what Pike is arguing in this chapter, we first have to unpack the title itself.
Yes, let's absolutely start there, because the listener might be wondering what exactly a Noachite is.
And what it has to do with the Prussian Knight.
Right, because the text assumes you already know the lore, and it is a wildly specific combination of words. So let's break down the etymology. Why Noachite? I assume we are talking about Noah, as in the biblical flood.
Precisely. In the Masonic and esoteric traditions that Pike is synthesizing here, the term Noachite refers to the descendants of Noah. But it's not just a genealogical term. It's a profound philosophical archetype. Just think about the narrative of the flood for a second.
Right.
Regardless of whether one views it as literal history or pure myth, the symbolic weight is just staggering. Society had become so fundamentally corrupt, so devoid of justice, and overrun by tyranny and violence that the entire operating system of civilization had to be wiped clean.
Wow. Yeah, wiped completely clean.
Right. And Noah represents the sole survivor. He's the moral outlier who maintained his integrity when the entire world around him had abandoned it.
So Noah is essentially the ultimate survivor of a collapsed civilization.
Exactly. And more importantly, he is the architect of the new one. When the waters recede, the Noachite is tasked with rebuilding society from scratch.
Which is a huge responsibility.
Huge. And they cannot build it on the same flawed foundations that led to the flood in the first place. So the Noachite tradition is obsessed with foundational justice. It is the philosophy of building a society that will not destroy itself.
Okay, that makes perfect sense for the Noachite half. But then Pike staples Prussian Knight to the title.
Right.
Which leaps forward thousands of years into European history. What is the connection there?
So this is where the historical lore becomes incredibly gripping. The Prussian Knight aspect of the 21st degree draws heavy inspiration from the Wemgericht, or the Wemmick courts, of medieval Germany, specifically Westphalia.
Wait, the secret tribunals.
Yeah.
I've read about these. They were essentially vigilante courts, weren't they?
Well, vigilante carries a modern connotation of lawlessness, but the historical reality was far more complex.
Oh, really?
Yeah. During the Middle Ages, the Holy Roman Empire was often in a state of chaotic fragmentation. The official, state-sanctioned courts were frequently entirely corrupt. I mean, bought and paid for by wealthy, tyrannical barons.
So the system was rigged.
Entirely. If a peasant was wronged by a lord, the official law offered zero protection. The law was merely a weapon of the powerful.
The operating system of justice had fundamentally failed.
Exactly. So, in response, the Wemgericht emerged. These were secret tribunals, often meeting at night in the deep forests.
That sounds so cinematic.
It does. And their members were sworn to absolute secrecy. Their mandate was to dispense true justice when the official legal system was either too corrupt or too weak to do so. They became a terrifyingly effective shadow justice system.
So Pike isn't like endorsing literal secret vigilante courts in the modern era.
Right. No, not at all. He is using the archetype of the Prussian Knight of the Wemgericht to illustrate a profound philosophical point.
Which is?
That there is a higher, older justice that exists independently of the official statutes of a corrupt state.
Okay, I see the synthesis now. Both the Noachite and the Prussian Knight are archetypes of individuals who find themselves in an environment where the official structures have failed or just become totally corrupted.
Yes.
And instead of succumbing to that corruption, they take it upon themselves to uphold a cosmic, objective standard of justice. They are like the emergency backup generators of human morality.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it, the backup generators. And it really explains why Pike begins the specific chapter by defining what he calls the absolute bedrock of society.
Right.
He asserts, unequivocally, that justice is the primary structure that maintains order. It is the prerequisite for civilization.
Let's really dig into that bedrock concept because the source material is very aggressive about this.
Very aggressive.
It doesn't say justice is a nice feature of a good society. It says that without justice, a society structurally cannot function. It guarantees three things: fairness, stability, and accountability.
And to understand the sheer weight of this assertion, we have to differentiate justice from other virtues.
Okay, like what?
Well, think about charity, mercy, empathy. These are vital, beautiful virtues. But they are the decorations on the building. Justice is the load-bearing foundation.
Oh, like that.
Right. You can have a society that lacks widespread charity. It might be a cold, harsh place to live, but it will physically hold together.
It functions.
Yes. But if you remove justice, If you remove the basic, predictable guarantee that actions have proportionate consequences and that the rules apply equally to all participants, the society rapidly disintegrates into tribal warfare and chaos.
But wait, how exactly are we defining justice here? Because earlier you mentioned that the text views justice not merely as a reactionary force, but as a proactive, structural one.
Right.
When most people hear the word justice, they picture a police officer catching a thief or a judge handing down a sentence. They picture a reaction to a bad deed.
And that is punitive justice, which is really only a small fraction of the whole. What Pike focuses on is structural justice.
Structural justice.
Think of it as the invisible gravity of the social contract. When you, as a citizen, walk out of your door in the morning, you operate on a million unspoken assumptions of justice.
Like what?
You assume the money in your bank account won't be arbitrarily confiscated by the state. You assume that if you stop at a red light, the cars going the other way will also obey the rules. You assume that if you sign a contract, there is a mechanism to enforce it.
So, justice is essentially the guarantee of predictability and fairness that allows strangers to cooperate.
Precisely. Structural justice is the environment of trust. It is proactive because the promise of that fairness is what prevents society from fracturing.
That makes total sense.
Without that promise, you don't even get to the point of a crime being committed. The entire system of commerce and interaction and civic life just freezes up.
Let's test this with a metaphor. I was actually thinking about this while reviewing the notes.
Okay, let's hear it.
So, if justice is the foundation of a house, are laws the walls?
Yeah, that tracks.
And if so, can you have a perfectly solid foundation of justice, but build terrible, crooked walls like flawed laws on top of it?
Oh.
Or conversely, could you have perfectly straight, mathematical, precise walls built on a foundation that is fundamentally cracked?
That is a fantastic analytical framework. Let's look at the latter first. Perfect walls on a cracked foundation. Imagine an authoritarian regime that is highly efficient. The laws are written with absolute clarity. The bureaucracy is a well-oiled machine. The trains run exactly on time.
Right. The legal code covers every conceivable aspect of life with zero ambiguity. The walls are perfectly straight.
Exactly. But the foundation is cracked. The foundation is cracked because the underlying premise of the society is fundamentally unjust.
So maybe it's built on a caste system or totalitarian surveillance.
Or the subjugation of a specific minority. In that scenario, the efficiency of the laws, the straightness of the walls, actually makes the house more terrifying.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
The flawless execution of the law merely accelerates the injustice. Eventually, the resentment builds in the subjugated population, the social contract snaps, and the house collapses, regardless of how neatly the walls were framed.
That makes a lot of historical sense. I mean, we've seen highly ordered regimes collapse violently because the populace realized the foundational premise was rigged against them.
Exactly.
So what about the reverse scenario? The foundation of justice is solid, but the walls are crooked.
This is a much more hopeful, though often really frustrating, scenario. Imagine a democracy that is genuinely committed at its core to human rights, equality, and fair representation.
So the foundation is solid.
The foundation is solid, but the humans building the house are flawed. They pass clumsy, inefficient laws. They create bureaucratic bottlenecks. They pass legislation that has unintended negative consequences.
The walls are warped. The roof leaks.
Right. But the house doesn't collapse.
Because the foundational commitment to justice holds it up.
Exactly. It provides the stability needed to renovate. The citizens might be immensely frustrated by the leaky roof, but because they trust the foundation, they use the mechanisms of justice to tear down the bad law and write a better one.
They amend the Constitution. They elect new leaders.
Right. The foundation of justice affords a society the durability to survive its own legislative mistakes.
I really want the listener to map this onto their own lived reality right now. Because we don't just see this in nations, right? We see it in micro-societies.
Oh, all the time.
Think about your workplace, or a homeowners association, or even a tight-knit family unit. When foundational justice is absent, when people realize that the rules only apply to certain favored individuals, or that promotions are based on nepotism rather than merit, how fast does that organization degrade?
Oh, the degradation is almost instantaneous. The moment the foundational trust and fairness evaporates, the behavior of the individuals changes immediately.
I have absolutely lived this. I worked for a company years ago where it became glaringly obvious that the sales team was allowed to routinely violate the company's compliance rules because they brought in revenue.
Classic.
Meanwhile, the operations staff was aggressively disciplined for minor infractions. And it wasn't just that the operations team got angry. It was that the entire culture became toxic overnight.
Of course.
People stopped collaborating. They started hoarding information. They started playing defensive politics. The actual functioning of the company just ground to a halt.
Because everyone shifted their energy from doing their jobs to simply protecting themselves from an unjust system.
Exactly. What I experienced was the collapse of the microsocial contract. I realized the foundation was cracked.
And your reaction, retreating into defensive self-preservation, is the exact mechanism by which a macro-society fails when justice is removed.
Yeah.
And this brings us to a crucial inflection point in Pike's text. If justice is this vital, and if bad laws can threaten it, then the Noachite must confront the most dangerous realization of all.
It is.
Law and justice are not synonyms.
And this is the part of the deep dive that requires us to really stretch our intellectual muscles, because the source material draws a hard, unmistakable line in the sand here.
It really does.
Law is a system of order. It provides rules, boundaries, and structure. It is the written code. But Pike insists, with the force of a hammer, that law is not always equal to justice.
It is a radical acknowledgement of human fallibility. Think about it. A law is merely an artifact created by human beings at a specific moment in time.
Right.
And human beings are limited by their biases, their historical ignorance, their economic interests, and just their sheer lack of foresight.
So the systems and rules they create must inherently carry those exact same flaws.
Exactly.
I want to introduce a legal concept here that might help our listeners categorize this, because I think it's a brilliant mental model. In classical legal theory, there is a distinction between crimes that are malum in se and crimes that are malum prohibitum.
Yes, that maps perfectly onto Pike's argument. Break those down for us.
Okay, so malum in se translates to wrong in itself. These are actions that are universally, objectively unjust, regardless of what the law says.
Right, like murder.
Murder, theft, unprovoked assault. Even if a society passed a law saying murder was legal on Tuesdays, murder would still be a profound violation of justice. It is inherently wrong.
The foundation of the house rejects it, regardless of what the walls say.
Exactly. Then you have malum prohibitum, which translates to wrong because it is prohibited.
Okay.
These are actions that are only illegal because a human authority wrote a rule against them to maintain order, like jaywalking, driving over the speed limit, or operating a business without the proper municipal permit.
Right. There is no cosmic, objective moral law against walking across a street outside of a painted crosswalk.
Right. It's only wrong because we all agreed on a rule to keep traffic flowing smoothly.
And here is where the friction occurs. The tension in Chapter 21 arises when a law, a malum prohibitum, is enforced so rigidly or blindly that it begins to generate a malum insa outcome.
When the rule, designed to maintain order, ends up causing an inherent moral wrong.
Exactly. Which brings us right back to our opening scenario with the judge and the stolen medical supplies.
Oh, right. The theft of the supplies technically violates the law.
But the rigid enforcement of that law, punishing a man for saving lives when the system failed, violates objective justice.
Yeah. And this realization that the written law can become a vehicle for injustice places an agonizing burden on the individual. The source material states that the Noachite cannot merely be a blind follower of rules.
No. They are forbidden from checking their conscience at the door.
They have to actively evaluate the fairness of the law, and when necessary, they must seek justice beyond the rules.
Which is a heavy lift.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here.
Huh.
I am going to push back incredibly hard on this point.
Bring it on.
Because this sounds like a recipe for absolute disaster.
Yeah.
It is highly romantic to talk about a noble knight seeking justice beyond the law. But in reality, who gets to decide what is just?
Right. The subjectivity problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you encourage a populace to decide for themselves which laws they respect and which ones they ignore because they deem them unfair, you don't get a utopia of enlightened knights. You get anarchy.
You get chaos.
You get a fractured society where everyone's subjective, biased opinion overrides the consensus of the law. How does Pike justify this without endorsing chaos?
That is the most important pushback you could offer, honestly. And it is the central paradox of democratic and ethical theory.
Right.
Because if subjective morality supersedes objective law, order collapses. But if objective law supersedes all morality, you get tyranny.
So how does the Noachite navigate this?
Well, the text does not advocate for anarchy. It advocates for a significantly higher, much more rigorous standard of ethical analysis.
Explain the mechanics of that. How does an individual break or bend a rule without tearing down the whole system?
It all comes down to intent and consequence. Anarchy is the rejection of the concept of order itself, usually for selfish gain or pure rebellion. An anarchist breaks a law to destroy the system.
Right.
The Noachite, conversely, operates out of a profound obedience to fairness. They do not reject the system. They recognize a localized failure within the system.
Okay, so it's a targeted intervention.
Exactly. When a Noachite steps outside the strict boundary of a rule, their goal is to correct a specific injustice and thereby restore the integrity of the foundational system.
I need an example for this. Let's move away from life or death courtrooms for a second and look at the complex systems that govern our modern lives. Think about the emerging field of AI governance and algorithmic bureaucracy.
Oh, that is a perfect modern arena for this philosophy.
So imagine a mid-level human operator working for a massive lending institution. Their job is to oversee an AI algorithm that approves or denies small business loans.
Okay.
The algorithm is the law of the company. It processes millions of data points and spits out a binary result. The human operator is just supposed to rubber stamp the algorithm's output.
Follow the rules, basically.
Right. Now, the operator notices a pattern. A specific subset of highly qualified, hardworking applicants from a particular zip code are being systematically denied.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah. The operator digs in and realizes the algorithm has inadvertently learned a historical bias, perhaps redlining data from decades ago, and is now enforcing an unjust prejudice under the guise of mathematical objectivity.
So the algorithm is functioning perfectly according to its programming. The walls are straight.
But the foundation is actively cracking. Now, the company policy, the law, explicitly states that the human operator is not allowed to override the algorithm without a 6-month review process by a higher committee. But these small businesses need the capital today to survive.
Right. Time is a factor.
If the operator follows the rule blindly, they protect their job, they follow the law, but they become an active participant in an unjust system. They enforce a melem in set outcome.
So what does the Noachite do in this situation?
The Noachite breaks the protocol. They use their administrative credentials to manually override the algorithm and approve the loans, knowing full well they might be fired or sued by the company. They break the rule to uphold the foundation of fairness.
And this example perfectly highlights why your earlier pushback about anarchy is resolved. The operator didn't destroy the bank.
Right.
They didn't delete the algorithm or steal money for themselves. They intervened in a highly specific, targeted manner to ensure that the ultimate purpose of the system fair lending was actually achieved when the mechanical rules failed.
But look at the sheer risk that operator took. By breaking the rule, they assumed massive personal liability. If those loans default, it's entirely on them. They can't blame the computer anymore.
And that brings us to the very heart of Chapter 21 and perhaps the most demanding section of our outline, the burden and liberation of moral accountability.
Yeah.
Because the system is imperfect, because the algorithm will eventually hallucinate a bias, or the hospital policy will leave a patient out in the cold, the ultimate responsibility falls squarely on the shoulders of the individual.
The source material is brutally uncompromising here. Every individual is responsible for their actions, period.
No exceptions.
The text demands that we act with acute awareness, that we accept the consequences of our choices, and that we take full ownership. The Noachite doesn't view accountability as a threat. They embrace it.
And we really need to dissect the psychological weight of what the text calls acting with awareness. Because what does it actually cost a human being to operate like this?
Exhausting.
It requires completely abandoning what we might call moral autopilot.
Moral autopilot. That is the default state for most of humanity, isn't it?
It is, because it is evolutionarily and psychologically efficient. You cannot subject every single micro-decision in your day to a rigorous ethical audit. You would be totally paralyzed.
You'd never leave the house.
Exactly. So we rely on heuristics. We do what is expected of us. We follow company protocols. We comply with the norms of our peer group. We follow the law. Autopilot allows us to function smoothly in society.
But the text is warning us that autopilot is also the ultimate moral hazard.
Because autopilot acts as a psychological shield. It insulates us from the agonizing weight of choice. If you are just following company policy, or if you are just executing the algorithm's output, you can convince yourself that any negative consequence isn't actually your fault.
You outsource your conscience to the bureaucracy.
Yes, it's the "I'm just a cog in the machine" defense, which historically has been the defense used to justify some of the most horrific atrocities in human history.
I didn't make the law, I just enforced it. Don't blame me.
It is the banality of evil. And the Noachite philosophy is a direct, aggressive countermeasure to that mindset.
So taking full responsibility implies that you can never use a flawed system, a bad law, or an order from a superior as a shield for your own unjust actions.
Never.
If you enforce a rule that you know, in your heart and mind, is causing unfair harm, you cannot blame the rulebook. You possessed agency, you chose to enforce it. Therefore, the moral debt belongs to you.
It belongs entirely to you.
Let's upgrade our metaphors here because I think it helps crystallize the concept.
Yeah.
In an earlier iteration of my notes, I thought about this as being the captain of a ship navigating with a bad map.
Okay.
If you crash the ship, you can't blame the map because you had eyes to see the rocks. But let's bring it into the 21st century. Think of the law as the autonomous driving system in a modern vehicle.
Oh, I like this. Walk us through it.
So when you engage the autonomous driving system, the car is following its programming. It's following the rules of the road.
Right.
But you, as the human in the driver's seat, are still required to keep your hands near the wheel and your eyes on the road. Why? Because the engineers know the system is imperfect.
It has blind spots.
Exactly.
Right.
It might misinterpret a shadow as a solid object or fail to recognize a pedestrian in unusual clothing. The algorithm handles the bulk of the driving, but the human is there specifically to handle the edge cases, the anomalies, the moral variables the code couldn't anticipate.
Right.
And crucially, legally and morally, if the autonomous car crashes, the human driver is held responsible. You cannot say the car did it.
That is a phenomenal analogy for the Noachite's relationship with the law. The law is the autonomous system. It manages the vast majority of social interactions efficiently.
Yeah.
But the Noachite must keep their hands on the moral steering wheel. When the legal algorithm encounters an ethical edge case, like the man stealing medical supplies to save lives, the Noachite must disengage the autopilot and take manual control.
And by doing so, they accept total liability for the outcome. But this sounds utterly exhausting. I mean, framed like that, moral accountability sounds like an unbearable, terrifying burden. You are constantly on watch. You are constantly absorbing risk. Why would anyone, let alone the archetypal knight, willingly embrace that level of stress?
Because, as the text argues, it is the only path to true liberation.
Okay, you have to explain that. How is carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders a form of liberation? That sounds like a total contradiction.
It is a paradox, but a profound one. Taking ownership is the only way an individual retains their agency in a universe governed by massive, indifferent systems.
Okay.
Think about the person who stays on autopilot. They are a passive participant. They are essentially an object being acted upon by external forces, the state, their employer, societal pressures.
They have given up their free will in exchange for the comfort of not being blamed.
They are a passenger in the autonomous car, asleep in the back seat.
Exactly. They have no control over the destination.
But the moment you accept moral accountability, the moment you say, I am responsible for the consequences of my actions, regardless of the system, you elevate yourself from a passive object to an active, sovereign moral agent. You reclaim your free will.
I see. The driver has all the stress of navigating the edge cases and avoiding the accidents, but the driver is the only one who actually gets to decide where the vehicle goes.
Precisely. The burden of accountability is the price of admission for moral sovereignty. You cannot be truly free if you are hiding behind the excuse of compliance.
Wow.
The Noachite embraces the burden because they value their own ethical freedom more than the cowardly comfort of plausible deniability.
That reframes everything. It transforms accountability from a punishment into a superpower. But if we are going to act as sovereign moral agents, manually overriding the system when it fails, we encounter a massive new problem.
We do.
And this brings us to the next section of the source material, the fragility of trust and the absolute necessity of consistency in judgment.
This is where the rubber meets the road, and where the philosophy is subjected to its harshest test. Because abstract ideals of moral agency are exhilarating to discuss, but they live or die on how consistently they are applied in the real world.
Right. And the core information in this section of the deep dive is stark. Justice must be consistent.
Must be.
This requires applying your ethical overrides fairly, avoiding personal bias, and treating all individuals equally. The text explicitly warns that inconsistent justice, even if well-intentioned, leads directly to distrust and the collapse of the social structure.
Yes.
Let's dissect the mechanics of inconsistency here. Why is hypocrisy more destructive to a society than strictness?
It basically comes down to human psychology and the need for predictability. Human beings are incredibly resilient. They can adapt to incredibly strict, even draconian environments, provided those environments are entirely predictable.
So tyrant versus hypocrite dynamic.
Exactly. If a king declares a harsh tax, but the tax is collected with absolute mathematical equality from every single citizen, the citizens will hate the tax, but they will understand the reality they live in. They can plan their lives around it. The structure holds.
But what happens when the king collects the harsh tax from the peasants, but issues secret exemptions to his wealthy friends?
Instant volatile rage. Absolute outrage. Because the psychological grain has shifted under their feet, the rule isn't actually a rule anymore. It is a weapon used selectively.
Right.
When rules or ethical judgments shift based on bias, personal preference, tribal loyalty, or status, the foundational trust we discussed at the very beginning of the deep dive just shatters.
It breaks the whole contract.
Exactly. Inconsistent justice sends a very clear, very dangerous message to the populace. The system is not designed to protect you. It is designed to manage you while protecting an in-group.
And once a population internalizes that message, the physics of societal collapse just take over. They stop reporting crimes because they don't trust the police. They stop paying taxes because they believe the funds are stolen.
Right.
They start looking for ways to cheat the system themselves because they feel the system has already cheated them. It's a cascading failure of the social contract.
Which is exactly why Pike warns that inconsistent justice rots the system from the inside out. Cynicism replaces civic duty. And cynicism is the rust that destroys the machinery of civilization.
Okay, but I am going to push back incredibly hard here again.
Yeah.
Because I think the text is demanding the impossible.
Okay, let's hear it.
We established that the Noachite has to step outside the law to enforce fairness. But the Noachite is human. You and I are human. Which means we are all carrying around an invisible backpack full of hidden biases.
We definitely are.
We have blind spots. We have tribal loyalties. We naturally favor people who look like us, think like us, or share our economic background. If human nature is inherently biologically biased, how on earth is anyone supposed to achieve the perfectly consistent judgment the text demands? Isn't Pike just setting up an impossible utopian standard?
He is setting an impossible standard, yes. But the impossibility doesn't invalidate the duty. Perfect consistency is the horizon line. You can never actually touch it, but it gives you the absolute direction in which you must travel.
So it's about the effort.
Exactly. The text doesn't ask the Noachite to be a flawless deity. It asks him to engage in the brutal, exhausting practice of relentless self-examination.
So it's not about being perfectly unbiased. It's about building internal psychological systems to catch your own flaws before they manifest as inconsistent justice.
Exactly. The Noachite doesn't pretend they don't have biases. They actively hunt them down within themselves. When you, as a moral agent, are called upon to make a judgment, whether you are a manager deciding on a promotion, a juror in a trial, or just a friend mediating a dispute, the accountability we discussed earlier requires you to run an internal diagnostic.
What does that diagnostic actually look like practically?
Well, it looks like adopting philosophical frameworks designed to strip away bias. Consider the concept of the veil of ignorance. It's a thought experiment later popularized by philosopher John Rawls, though the conceptual mechanics echo perfectly with Pike's Noachite ideals.
Okay, what is the veil of ignorance?
When deciding if an action or a rule is just, you must imagine designing the rule without knowing what position you will occupy in the resulting society. You don't know if you will be rich or poor, the CEO or the janitor, the judge or the defendant.
Well, that is a brilliant way to force fairness. Because if you don't know if you'll be the one enforcing the rule or the one being crushed by it, you will naturally design the most equitable rule possible.
Precisely. And in daily life, the internal diagnostic requires you to ask deeply uncomfortable questions, like, would I react the exact same way if the roles were reversed?
Right.
Would I enforce this company policy as strictly if it was my favorite employee violating it instead of the employee I find really annoying?
Oh, that's tough. That is the friction of ethics rubbing up against instinct. It requires you to actively fight your own nature.
It does, and that effort itself builds trust. People can forgive a leader or a judge who makes a genuine, transparent mistake. They rarely forgive deliberate, unexamined hypocrisy. By constantly striving to neutralize your own bias, you uphold the integrity of whatever system you are operating within.
Which brings us perfectly to the grand finale of the material we are covering today, the ultimate synthesis balancing law and ethics for society.
Yes. We have spent the last hour pulling law and justice apart, examining their flaws, and placing the terrifying burden of moral agency on the individual.
We've torn it all down.
Exactly. Now we have to look at how the Noachite is supposed to put it all back together into a functional whole.
Right. Because if we leave it here, we just have a bunch of rogue individuals constantly overriding the system based on their own internal diagnostics. That leads us right back to the chaos we were trying to avoid.
Right.
The synthesis here is that law provides structure, but ethics provide guidance. The Noachite must balance legal responsibility with moral responsibility, because true justice is the alignment of both.
It is the integration of the internal and the external.
Let's try to visualize this. Think of a society like a massive, heavy locomotive traveling across a continent.
Okay.
If you only have the legal engine running pure law, strict compliance, no ethical oversight, you get a machine that is cold, robotic, and potentially incredibly cruel. It follows the tracks perfectly. But if the tracks lead right through the center of a vulnerable community, the train won't slow down because the schedule is a schedule and the track is the track.
Right.
The law is absolute, but it lacks empathy.
A society of pure compliance inevitably crushes the outliers.
Yes. But if you flip it and you only have the ethical engine running without the law, pure subjective morality without a written code or a constitution, you get disorganized, chaotic idealism.
Chaos.
You have no tracks. Everyone is driving the train in different directions based on what they passionately feel is right in the moment. The train derails immediately, you never reach a destination, and you destroy the cargo. You need both to move forward safely.
That analogy perfectly captures the synthesis. Law is the vehicle. It provides the steel tracks, the containment, the agreed-upon mechanisms for dispute resolution, and the predictable distribution of resources.
Yeah.
Ethics is the steering mechanism. It's the human engineer in the cabin ensuring that the vehicle is actually heading toward a destination of human flourishing. The ultimate goal of the Noachite isn't just to achieve personal, isolated purity.
Right. They aren't monks retreating to a mountaintop cave to be perfectly moral in silence. They are knights. And knights operate down in the mud of the real world.
Exactly. Their mandate is to contribute to broader social stability. They act as the friction-free alignment between doing what is legally required and what is morally right.
Okay.
In a perfectly healthy society, those two circles overlap almost entirely. The law reflects justice. But when a society becomes sick, those circles pull apart. The Noachite's job, their sacred duty, is to grab those two circles and pull them back together.
So they're essentially the repair workers on the tracks of society. And this points to something I found incredibly profound in the text. We always think of justice as something that flows from the top down.
Always.
We wait for the Supreme Court to hand down a ruling, or for the president to sign a bill, or for the CEO to change the corporate culture. We view justice as something dispensed by the powerful.
But Chapter 21 insists that this is an illusion. True justice is upheld from the bottom up.
From the bottom up, by the individuals who refuse to go on autopilot.
Yes. The macro structure of society is entirely dependent on the micro decisions of its citizens. Justice lives in the administrator who pushes the delayed paperwork through to get a patient their medication.
Yeah.
It lives in the mid-level manager who refuses to play favorites during layoffs. It lives in the citizen who obeys the law, not because they fear the police, but because they recognize their duty to their neighbors.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
If the everyday populace abdicates their personal moral accountability, if everyone just says, I'm just following orders, no amount of top-down policing or brilliant legislation can save that society from collapse.
Justice lives or dies in the mundane, daily choices of ordinary people deciding to be fair. That is incredibly heavy, but it's also profoundly empowering.
Very empowering.
It means that the state of the world isn't just weather happening to you. It's an architecture that you are actively participating in building or destroying every single day.
Which brings us back to the ultimate thesis of the chapter. The burden of accountability is the ultimate expression of human agency.
Wow. We have covered some massive tectonic ideas today. We started by redefining justice, not merely as a punishment for crimes, but as the load-bearing, proactive foundation of civilization itself.
We did.
We drew a hard, necessary line between the written law and the actual realization of fairness, acknowledging that systems often fail. We talked about the heavy yet liberating burden of personal moral agency, refusing the comfort of moral autopilot and taking manual control of the wheel.
Right.
We explored how inconsistent judgment and hidden bias rot trust from the inside out.
Yep.
And finally, we looked at the synthesis, the absolute necessity of balancing the tracks of the law with the human guidance of ethics to build a functional society from the bottom up.
It is a rigorous, exhausting curriculum for anyone striving to live an intentional life.
It really is. And now, to the learner listening, I want to turn this directly over to you. Because the entire point of Morals and Dogma is not to just passively consume abstract philosophy.
It's a mirror.
It demands aggressive self-reflection. So I want to pose the questions that this specific chapter inherently asks of all of us. When you look at your own life, do you take full, uncompromising responsibility for your actions? Or do you frequently find yourself using the system, the rules, your boss, or your circumstances as an excuse to avoid the weight of your choices? Do you just follow the rules because it is the path of least resistance? Or do you take the time to truly understand the underlying purpose of those rules and their actual impact on the people around you?
Great question.
And perhaps most importantly, when you encounter a clear injustice, when you see that the law and fairness have violently pulled apart in your workplace or your community, how do you respond? Do you look away and rely on autopilot, or do you accept the liability required to correct it?
Those are the questions that separate the passive participant from the Noachite.
They are. Now, looking ahead, we are far from finished with this journey. In our next deep dive, we're going to move to Chapter 22, exploring the archetype of the Knight of the Royal Axe.
That's a great one.
The focus is going to shift slightly, moving from the mechanics of justice toward how labor, dedication, and perseverance take on profound philosophical meaning. It is going to be a fascinating exploration of the dignity of work and what it takes to build something that outlasts you. You will not want to miss it.
Before we sign off, if I may leave the listener with a final thought to mull over, building on everything we've debated today regarding the tension between law and personal ethics.
Please do.
If true justice requires us to actively evaluate the law through a rigorous ethical lens, and if moral accountability is our unavoidable personal burden to bear, does our silent, comfortable compliance with an unfair rule make us the co-authors of that injustice?
Are we the co-authors of the injustice we silently walk past? Man, that is a haunting thought that is going to linger with me for a long time.
Yeah.
We started today by talking about stepping out of the philosophy class and walking into the courtroom of life. It turns out, in that courtroom, you aren't just an observer in the gallery. You are the judge, the jury, the witness, and the architect of the laws themselves, all rolled into one.
Beautifully said.
Until next time, step off autopilot, act with deliberate responsibility, seek fairness wherever you have the power to do so, and remember that justice isn't just a concept you wait for, it is something you must actively do. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.